Brothers and sisters, hell is real. I experienced it. Today I want to share with you my testimony from the Valley of the Fornicators, a place where I understood the consequences of my choices, but I also experienced the immense power of conversion and forgiveness. If you are looking for hope, if you need a second chance, this story is for you. And before starting, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because here you will find more stories like this that can change your life. My name is Isabella, and if they had ever told me that my life would take such a dark turn, I would never have believed it. I grew up in a home where faith was everything. My mother was a woman of prayer, and every morning her soft voice could be heard in the corner of the house as she read the Bible and asked God to take care of our family. My father, although more reserved, always told us the world will offer us many things, but only the Lord that has what we really needs. During my childhood, that faith seemed enough to me. I went to church on Sundays, I sang in the choir and knew by heart verses that spoke of the love of God. But as I grew up, something began to change in me. I don't know exactly when it started, but I remember I looked at my friends' life. I saw that their lives was full of adventures and excitement. I felt that mine was boring. They talked about boys' parties and exciting trips, while I spent the afternoons at home helping my mother or reading the Bible with my grandmother. When I turned 18, I graduated from high school and felt like the world was at my feet. I started studying at university and everything changed. It was like a new world opened up in front of me. Fraternity parties, invitations to nightclubs, fancy clothes, and a circle of friends who always seemed to be living in the moment. At first I was shy. I remember my first party. I stood in a corner while the others danced and drank, but something in me said, why not do it? What can happen? That's how it all began. The first drink, the first dance. I came home after midnight. At first I felt a pang of guilt every time I walked through the door of my house and saw the light in my mother's room on. I knew he was praying for me, but little by little that guilt faded away. Instead, an inner voice told me, Isabella, you are doing nothing wrong, you are just living your life. Don't let fear stop you. In the weekends, life became more intense. I met people who did not share my values, but they were exciting, daring and full of new ideas. They told me that faith was a cage, that I should break my chains and experience everything that life had to offer, and in my ignorance I believed them. I stopped going to church. At first it was once, then twice, until I convinced myself that I did not need God. I always said He knows that I love Him, but I do not have time for those things. Now in a short time the parties became a routine and the boys came like a storm. At first I was excited by the attention I received, for it was flattering to feel desired and as if someone was always waiting for my message or my call. But with each relationship that began, it also ended with a bigger void. I did not recognize it at that moment, but something inside me was dying. My values and my beliefs, the voice of my conscience, everything seemed to go silent in the middle of the noise. I remember one particular night. It was a huge party full of lights, music and unknown faces. I was wearing a red dress that I had bought especially for that occasion. My friends told me that I looked beautiful and the boys couldn't stop looking at me. But between all that laughter and the noise I felt something strange. It was as if for a moment the noise disappeared and I was completely alone. I looked around and asked myself, this is it? Is this where I should be? But before that thought could grow, a friend took me by the arm and led me to the center of the track. I lost myself in the moment and buried that little voice that tried to talk to me. My parents started to notice the changes in me. My mother tried to talk to me to remind me who I was, but every time she did I got mad. I would say hurtful things to her. I'm not a little girl, Mom, let me live my life. She would just sigh and go back to praying. Now looking back, it hurts me to think how many nights she cried for me. That was the start of my detour. Everything seemed bright on the outside, but inside something was starting to slowly break. At that moment I didn't know, but I was about to face the consequences of my choices, and even though I didn't understand it, God never stopped calling me. At first I ignored those little signs and that emptiness that started to show up in the moments of silence. I told myself that it was normal, that maybe I just needed to fill my life with more things, more experiences, more achievements. The truth is that after a while I began to feel like something was missing, but I didn't know what it was. On the outside my life seemed perfect. I had got a good job after college, I had friends who were always willing to go out with me, and every weekend was full of plans. But at night when I was alone I felt a deep emptiness, as if everything I did was meaningless. So I told myself maybe I just need something more, something better, something bigger. That search became my obsession. I thought that if I managed to reach certain goals that emptiness would disappear. First I focused on material things. I convinced myself that I needed things to feel happy. I started buying expensive clothes, brand name, shoes and accessories that made me feel important. I posted photos on social media with each new outfit, hoping that others would tell me how good I looked, and yes, I received many comments, many likes. For a moment those words filled my heart, but not many hours passed before that emptiness returned. Then I thought maybe I need someone who truly loves me, and I began to look for that in relationships that deep down I knew were not right. At first the boys treated me like a queen. They sent me messages all day long. They invited me to places luxurious and made me feel special. But over time those relationships fell apart, for there were always arguments, lies, and finally they ended, and every time that happened I felt more broken than before. I told myself maybe the problem is me, I'm not enough. In one of those moments of weakness I met someone who seemed to have everything I wanted. He was charming, self-confident, and above all he made me feel as if I was the only thing that mattered. I was willing to do anything to make that relationship work, but he didn't want a real commitment. He was only interested in the superficial. When everything ended I felt used, as if I was nothing. But instead of stopping to reflect I simply jumped to the next relationship, hoping that this time it would be different, and it wasn't. At the same time I told myself that I should try harder in my career. I thought that if I got a promotion, if I earned more money, everything would be different. I started to work long hours, sacrificing my free time and even my health. When I finally got that promotion that I wanted so much, I felt euphoric for a few days, but the emptiness was still there. I sat at my fancy desk surrounded by papers and important calls, and I wondered why I don't feel happy, why this isn't enough. I also tried to fill that void with trips and experiences. I planned getaways to exotic places. I posted pictures on the beach with a drink in my hand and a big smile on my face, but on those nights when I lay in bed at some fancy hotel the emptiness was even more evident. It was as if nothing I did could fill that space in my heart. I remember one night in particular I went out with my friends to an exclusive event. Everyone was dressed up, the lights were bright and the music was perfect. I was wearing a dress that had cost me more than it should have, but I felt beautiful. At first everything seemed magical. I danced, I drank, I laughed, but at one point as I looked around, I realized that no one really knew each other. Everyone was there to show off, to show themselves as someone they were not. I felt a knot in my stomach and I asked myself, this is it? This is how I want to live my life? Yet I ignored that inner voice. I told myself it's just a bad day, tomorrow will be better, but it didn't get better. Every time I tried to fill my heart with things from the world, that emptiness seemed to grow bigger. It was like I was building a house with sand, and every time a wave came everything fell apart. The glamour of the world had deceived me. I had believed that things, relationships and success would make me happy, but all that was like a mirage in the desert. It promised a lot, but it had no substance. The worst of all is that deep down I knew the truth. I knew I was looking in the wrong places, but I didn't want to admit it. I thought I could fix it on my own, that I just needed to try harder, and the more I tried the further I felt from the peace I longed for. Even so I continued to act as if everything was fine. My social networks were my refuge, a showcase where I projected a perfect life, parties, trips, brand clothes and smiles, surrounded by friends. Everything seemed in its place, but it was just a facade. Inside something was not right. There were nights when, despite being surrounded by people, I felt completely alone. My heart was restless, as if an inner voice was trying to talk to me, but I refused to listen, afraid of what I might discover if I stopped. My mood was unstable. One day I could be euphoric, convinced that everything was fine, and the next I felt sunk in an abyss of sadness without understanding why. My friends noticed my change, but I hid it behind a forced smile and phrases like, I'm just tired, tomorrow I'll be better. One night after a work day and an outing with friends that ended very late, I got home feeling strange. My body was exhausted but my mind kept spinning. I went to bed trying to ignore that feeling, but when I closed my eyes I came across something I will never forget in my dream. I was walking through an unknown place. At first it seemed like a normal landscape, but soon everything began to change. The sky turned dark and the air became heavy as if it were difficult to breathe. In the distance I saw a reddish glow as if there was a gigantic fire. As I got closer I could hear screams. They were screams of anguish, of desperation that froze my blood. My heart was beating strongly and although I wanted to stop my feet kept moving forward as if I had no control over them. When I finally got to the place where the screams came from I saw something that filled me with terror. There was a shadow moving among the flames, figures that writhed in pain. The fire did not seem to consume them but their suffering was palpable. One of those figures turned towards me and although it had no face I felt that its eyes were fixed on me. Then a voice resonated loud and clear, but at the same time it seemed to come from within me. It tells me, "For how much longer are you going to ignore me?" I woke up startled, with my heart racing and a cold sweat covering my body. I looked around making sure I was in my room. But the fear was still there. I sat up in bed hugging myself while I tried to understand what I had just experienced. I knew it was not just any dream. There was something in that place, in those words, that I could not ignore. During the day I tried to continue with my routine but the images of the dream came back to my mind again and again. I felt distracted, unable to concentrate. That emptiness that I had felt for so long seemed bigger now, as if something inside me was screaming for attention. That night my mother called me on the phone. We always talked about superficial things but this time not. Something in my voice said, "Isabel, you are okay, you have something in your heart." Hearing those words my eyes filled with tears, but I denied and said, "I'm okay Mom, I'm just tired." But I wasn't okay and I knew she knew it too. Before she hung up she said, "I'm praying for you no matter how far away you feel you are, God is still calling you." That call echoed in my mind for days. I was afraid to admit it but I knew something wasn't right. It was like my whole life was built on a house of cards that was about to collapse. The dream, the screams, that feeling of emptiness, constant, everything was a sign but I didn't want to see it. I tried to move on ignoring what I felt but deep down I knew that my time to worship God was coming to an end. When one random weekend I decided to visit my mother. I had not seen her for weeks, maybe months, because I was too busy with my busy and successful life. She has always greeted me with that warm smile that seemed to envelop everything. When entering her house everything was the same, simple, quiet, full of photos of my childhood and Bible verses on the walls. But this time as I walked through the door I felt a different weight, as if something inside me was reminding me how long it had been since I allowed myself to think about deeper things. Even so I forced myself to put those thoughts aside as I always did. After a while of casual chat about my work, the parties and the superficial things that I considered important, my mother changed the tone of the conversation. She looked me straight in the eyes with that look that always seemed to know more than I wanted to admit and said, "Isabella, daughter, how is your heart?" That question took me by surprise. I laughed a little nervously and answered something like, "Mom, I'm fine, everything is perfect." "Why do you ask that?" She sighed and settled in the chair as if she were getting ready to say something she had been keeping to herself for a long time. She pulled out her Bible, the one that was always on the dining room table, and opened it carefully. Her hands, already marked by the years and hard work, turned the pages with familiarity. She finally stopped at a passage and began to read in that soft voice she always used when she wanted me to really listen. "Daughter, listen to what he says. Come to me all who are weary and burdened and I will give you rest." I felt a lump in my throat but I didn't say anything. She continued speaking calmly but with a strength that I couldn't ignore. "Isabella, you may think you have it all under control, but I see in your eyes that you are tired, and I know that deep down you knows that the path you are following will not lead you to anything good. God has not forgotten you, daughter. He is calling you but you need to repent and give your life to Him. All that you seek in the things of the world you will only find in Him." At that moment I couldn't help but laugh. It was a nervous, almost sarcastic laugh, but behind it there was discomfort, even fear. "Mum, "Please," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just living my life. I don't need to regret your welcome. Besides, I have plenty of time to think about those things when I'm old. Now I want to enjoy, you understand." She didn't flinch. She just looked at me with that expression that mixed sadness and love at the same time. "Daughter, time doesn't belong to us. You think that there will always be a tomorrow, but nobody knows how much time there is. I don't want you to wait until it's too late to return to God." Her words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I felt a pang in my chest, but I refused to let it show. I quickly changed the subject, talking about trivial things to avoid thinking about what she had just told me. She as always did not insist. She just listened to me and answered with patience, but I knew she was still praying for me even as we talked that night. When we got home I couldn't think about the conversation. My mother's words echoed in my mind like an echo. "God is calling you." I tried to ignore it. I immersed myself in my phone, in social media, in anything that would distract me, but every time the silence returned that phrase came back. For an instant I thought about opening a Bible and praying, in trying to feel what my mother was talking about, but I convinced myself that it was not necessary. I told myself it is not the time, I have all the work ahead, and with that excuse I continued forward, ignoring the slight tremor in my soul, as if it were not important. But what I did not know is that that divine invitation would leave so easily, because God in His mercy would not stop calling me even though I tried to cover my ears and look away. One night after a particularly loud and exhausting party I came home feeling completely empty. I had drunk too much and danced to exhaustion, and yet the pain was still there, growing inside me like a shadow I couldn't ignore. I collapsed without even taking off my shoes, wishing that sleep would give me a respite from the storm inside me. But what happened that night was something I had never experienced before. I closed my eyes and suddenly I found myself in a completely different place. It was not a normal dream. Everything was so vivid, so real. I could feel the cold on my skin and the weight of the air around me. I was walking down a dark path surrounded by shadows that seemed to move around me, although I couldn't clearly see what they were. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence was deafening, interrupted only by a slight murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. As I moved forward, the murmur grew louder until it became screams. There were heartbreaking screams full of pain and despair. I wanted to turn around and run away from that place, but my feet did not respond. It was as if I was trapped, forced to continue ahead. The road became narrower, and in the distance I saw a reddish glow that illuminated the shadows in an eerie way. When I got closer I saw something I will never forget. There was a huge valley full of flames that did not consume anything but that burned with a terrifying intensity. Among the flames there were figures that writhed and screamed. Some were on their knees, others jumped with their hands as if they were asking for help, but there was no one to hear them. The heat was suffocating, but what terrified me the most was not that but the emptiness I felt in that place. It was as if everything good, everything pure had disappeared, leaving only pain and despair. While I watched one of the figures turn towards me, I could not see his face clearly, but I felt that he was looking me straight in the eyes. It was then that I heard a loud and clear voice that resonated throughout the place. I do not know if it came from within me or from the shadows, but it said, "This is what you have chosen. It is what there is to be." From my bed I stayed paralyzed, unable to move, as the words echoed over and over, "This is what you have chosen." My heart was pounding and fear enveloped me like a shadow. I wanted to scream but I had no voice. I wanted to run but there was nowhere to go. All I could do was stay there, facing the reality of my choices. Suddenly everything changed. The flames began to burn brighter and the shadows around me seemed to close in on me. It was then when I heard another voice, this time soft but firm, like a whisper that cut through the chaos. It said, "There is still time to go back." That voice, so different from the first, and filled me with something I had not felt in a long time, hope. I opened my eyes suddenly and found myself back in my room. My heart was pounding and I was drenched in cold sweat. I looked around trying to convince myself that it had only been a dream, but I knew it was not. Everything had been too real. I sat on the bed shaking as the words continued to echo in my mind. "This is what that you have chosen. There is still time to go back." That night I did not sleep anymore. I sat by the window looking at the darkness outside, trying to understand what I had experienced. I knew it had been a warning, a call to change, but I also knew I was not ready to face it, yet I was too proud. I tried to ignore it, not realizing that God would not stop calling me. But even though I tried to move forward, that experience kept haunting me. The images of that place, the screams, the words that echoed in my mind, everything came back to me. Every time I closed my eyes, it was as if something inside forcing you, thinking that maybe sleep would give me relief, but instead of rest I was dragged back to that place I never thought I would see again. The heat was unbearable. The air around me seemed made of fire and ashes, and every breath was an effort that burned my lungs. Around me the flames seemed to consume everything, but they did not go out or destroy anything. It was as if they were there just to burn eternally, and in the middle of that fire, I saw figures at first that I couldn't quite make out what they were. But then I saw them clearly. They were people, they weren't shadows. They were men and women. They were standing, the kneeling or lying on the ground, screaming with a desperation I had never heard before. Some were holding their heads, others raised their hands to the non-existent sky, begging for something or someone that didn't seem to respond. The screams were the most terrifying. They were heartbreaking, full of suffering and regret. But what froze my soul was that many of those voices repeated over and over again, "Why didn't I listen? Why didn't I pay attention?" They were words full of remorse, a constant echo that mixed with the roar of the fire and the laments that seemed to come from everywhere. Every time those words resonated, I felt like an invisible dagger pierced my chest. Why didn't I listen? That phrase was embedded in my mind as if it was meant for me. I looked around, trying to understand where I was and how I had gotten there, but the more I looked, the more terror filled me. The figures in the flames were not strangers, for some faces looked familiar. It was as if in each face I saw a fragment of someone I had known, someone who had been a part of my life. Even in their suffering I could recognize features that seemed familiar to me, a childhood friend, an old co-worker, even a face that reminded me of my own. I saw a woman who was standing with her face bathed in tears that could not put out the flames around her. She was screaming something, but I did not understand what. Her voice was breaking in a lament, and her hands were trying to cover her face as if she could not bear the weight of what she was seeing or feeling. Behind her a man was on his knees, hitting the ground with his fists while he screamed, "Forgive me, God, please forgive me," but there was no answer, only the echo of his own voice lost in the void. As he walked I realized that my own steps did not make noise. It was as if I was not really there, but at the same time I could feel all the heat, the smell of sulfur, the weight of despair in the environment. I felt that my feet were being guided, that I had no control over where I was going. Each step took me deeper into that valley of suffering. At one point I heard a scream that stood out from the others. It was so loud and heartbreaking that it made me stop. I turned around and I saw a figure that was all alone apart from the others. She was hunched over with her hands covering her face. I approached even though I didn't want to, because something in me told me I should. When I was close enough, the figure raised its head and what I saw took my breath away. It was me. My own face looked at me, distorted by pain and despair. My eyes were filled with tears and terror, and my mouth was murmuring the same words that I had heard so many times since I came to that place. Why didn't I listen? I staggered back. How could I be there? And then I understood it was a warning, a vision of the outcome of my life.